All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. You know why you're here, Remedy, to get right to the heart of things, no messing around. And today we've got a pretty exciting topic to dive into. Meta's latest and greatest AI models. They're calling it the Llama 4 family.
That's right, and we got some great articles to help us break it all down. Mainly, we're going to be looking at pieces from The Verge and Ars Technica. They do a fantastic job of explaining what Meta announced and how the AI community has been reacting. And let me tell you, there have been some pretty strong reactions so far.
Yeah, the AI world moves fast, and everyone's got opinions, especially when Meta makes a big move like this. But that's exactly why we're here today. We want to cut through the noise, look past the initial hype, and really understand what Llama 4 is all about. What did Meta actually claim, and does the early evidence back those claims up? Let's start with the basics. Meta made their big announcement on Saturday, April 5th. What exactly did they reveal?
Well, they unveiled two new models that are kind of leading the charge, so to speak. We've got Scout, which is the smaller of the two, and then there's Maverick, which they're positioning as more of a mid-range model. And Meta definitely didn't hold back when it came to talking about their potential.
No kidding. They made some pretty bold claims suggesting that Maverick could actually outperform some of the heavy hitters out there, like GPT-4o and Gemini 2.0 Flash. And they're talking about beating them on various benchmark tests. That's a big statement to make, especially in a field that's constantly evolving.
It is. And to add even more fuel to the fire, they also gave us a glimpse of something even bigger that's coming down the pipeline. They're calling it Llama 4 Behemoth, and this thing is massive. We're talking 288 billion active parameters,
Yeah.
and that's just part of a total of 2 trillion. The anticipation is that Behemoth could even surpass the likes of GPT 4.5 and Claude Sonnet 3.7, specifically in STEM-focused benchmarks. Now, of course, the big caveat here is that we haven't actually seen Behemoth in action yet, so it's all speculation at this point.
So a lot of power under the hood, but it's not just about the sheer size of these models, right? The way they're designed and built plays a crucial role in their capabilities, too.
Absolutely. One of the things Meta really emphasized was their use of what it called a mixture of experts, or MOE architecture, across the entire Llama 4 family. And this is where things get really interesting, because it all comes down to efficiency. Imagine you have a team of specialists, right? Each one is an expert in their own field. Now, when a problem comes up, you wouldn't necessarily need the entire team to work on it. You'd only call in the specialists whose expertise is relevant to that particular problem.
Right, it's about using the right tools for the job.
Exactly. And that's the basic idea behind MOE. Instead of activating the entire model for every task, it selectively activates only the parts, the experts that are needed for that specific task. This saves a lot of computational power and makes the model much more efficient.
Got it. So it's not just brute force, it's about smart allocation of resources. Okay, let's take a closer look at Scout and Maverick specifically. What are the key details that stand out for each of them?
Okay, so starting with Scout, we're looking at a model with 109 billion total parameters, with 17 billion of those being active across 16 different expert modules. They're presenting it as a really capable but also compact model, and they're claiming that it outperforms Google's Gemma 3 and Gemini 2.0 Flashlight, as well as Mistral 3.1, across a bunch of different benchmark tests. What's really interesting is that they're saying it's efficient enough to run on just a single high-end NVIDIA H100 GPU. Plus, it boasts a claimed 10 million token context window, so potentially it could process a huge amount of information all at once.
10 million tokens, that's a massive amount of data. And what about Maverick? How does it stack up?
Well, Maverick takes a significant step up in terms of scale. It has 400 billion total parameters, but it keeps that same 17 billion active parameters, and this time they're spread out across 128 experts, a lot more than Scout. Meta is saying that when it comes to things like coding and reasoning, Maverick's capabilities are right up there with DeepSeek v3. But here's the kicker. They're claiming it can do this with less than half the active parameters, which again speaks to that efficiency aspect.
So they're really pushing the idea of doing more with less. Now, another fascinating point is that Meta's calling Llama 4 natively multimodal. What does that actually mean in terms of how these models make sense of the world?
Right, so with most models, you've got separate systems for processing things like text and images, and then you have to somehow combine the outputs later. But what Meta is doing with early fusion is different. They've designed Llama 4 to understand both types of data right from the get-go, during the initial processing stages. It's like learning two languages simultaneously from childhood. Your understanding becomes much more integrated. And this directly puts Llama 4 in competition with other multimodal models like GPT-4o and Gemini, which can also handle different types of data.
So it's like they're building in that multisensory understanding from the ground up. Fascinating stuff. But this is where we start to get into some, let's just say, spirited discussion, especially when it comes to benchmark performance.
Yeah, that's a crucial area to unpack because there's been a lot of back and forth about how those benchmarks were actually achieved. So Maverick quickly climbed the ranks and landed at the #2 spot on the El Marina benchmark site. Now, as AI researcher Simon Willison has pointed out, El Marina is generally considered a pretty reliable benchmark.
Right, so people pay attention to those rankings.
Definitely. And Meta themselves really highlighted Maverick's ELO score of 1317 in their press release. To put that into perspective, that score put Maverick above GPT-4o, which understandably generated a lot of initial buzz and excitement. It seemed like Meta had a real contender on their hands. But then, as often happens in the AI world, the research community started to dig a little deeper, and they uncovered some discrepancies.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good.
Well, it turns out that the version of Maverick that got that impressive score on El Marino wasn't actually the standard publicly available version. It was what Meta called an experimental chat version, specifically tuned for conversational abilities. This revelation started to make waves when reports, like the one in TechCrunch, came out highlighting the difference.
So it wasn't exactly a level playing field. The benchmark result didn't necessarily reflect what a developer or a user would experience with the model that was actually being released.
Right, and this discrepancy didn't go unnoticed by El Marina. They released a statement expressing their concern that what Meta didn't really align with their policies, which aimed for fairness and reproducibility in their evaluations. Since then, they've even announced that they're updating their leaderboard policies to make things clearer in the future.
Transparency is key in these situations. So how did Meta respond to all of this? Did they address the concerns raised by El Marina and the community?
Well, a spokesperson from Meta stepped in to clarify things. They explained that they're constantly experimenting with all sorts of customized versions of their models, and it just so happened that this particular experimental version performed exceptionally well in El Marina. They also made sure to emphasize that they've now released the open-source version of Maverick. However, this explanation hasn't really quieted the concerns about transparency and whether Meta was being entirely upfront about what they were showcasing.
I can see why people would still be a bit skeptical. If companies are putting out benchmark results from highly specialized versions that aren't what the public actually gets access to, it really casts a shadow of doubt on how reliable those benchmarks are as a guide for real-world performance.
Absolutely. Simon Willison put it very succinctly when he said that it makes those top rankings feel a lot less meaningful.
Yeah.
He even admitted that he was initially impressed by Maverick's El Marina score, but now regrets not having looked closer at the specific version that was actually tested.
And his opinion carries some weight. He's been pretty vocal about El Marina being the most widely respected general benchmark because all of the other ones suck. So for him to feel misled, that's saying something.
It really underscores how crucial transparency is in the world of AI benchmarks. When the model that gets that top spot isn't readily available in the same form, it creates a disconnect and can even erode trust in the entire benchmarking process.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another topic that's been generating a lot of discussion. Meta's continued use of the label open source for Llama 4.
Right? Even with all the hype surrounding the release, that open source designation has been met with quite a bit of scrutiny. And that scrutiny really boils down to certain licensing restrictions that Meta has put in place.
What exactly are those restrictions, and why are they causing such a stir in the open source community?
Well, the main sticking point is this. If you're a commercial entity and you have over 700 million monthly active users, you need to get a specific license from Meta to use the Llama 4 models. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky. The Open Source Initiative, which is pretty much the authority on defining what constitutes open source, has made it clear that this kind of restriction doesn't actually align with their definition of open source. They've even suggested that the term open weight might be a more accurate way to describe it because technically the model's parameters are still publicly available.
So while the core data is out there, there are strings attached, especially for those big players in the tech world. It's a nuanced distinction, but it's an important one for a lot of people.
Exactly. It really highlights the ongoing debate about what open really means when we're talking about these incredibly large and powerful AI models and how that interpretation can differ even within the AI and open source communities themselves.
Okay, so we've talked about the announcements, the benchmark controversies, and the whole open source debate. Now let's get down to brass tacks. How is Llama 4 actually performing out in the wild? What's the overall reaction been like from the AI community? From what I've gathered, it's been a bit muted.
You could say that. Arla Technica, for example, described the initial reactions as being mixed to negative, and that seems to be a pretty fair assessment.
Hmm.
There's definitely a sense of skepticism out there when it comes to some of Meta's more ambitious claims.
One of the things that seems to be raising eyebrows, or maybe even a few red flags, is that claimed 10 million token context window for Scout. That was a big talking point in the announcement.
Definitely. And while Meta was touting that massive context window as a major feature, early experiences suggest that actually using it is proving to be a lot more difficult than they made it sound. Several third-party platforms, Grok, Fireworks, and Together AI, all offer access to these models. But they've all had to implement some pretty significant limitations on Scout's context window in their services. We're talking about reducing it to 128,000 or even just 328,000 tokens in some cases. That's a huge difference from the 10 million that Meta was advertising.
It's a massive gap. So, what's going on there? Why are these platforms having to scale things back so drastically?
The main culprit seems to be the sheer amount of computational power and memory that's needed to handle such a large context effectively. Even Meta's own demonstration notebook indicates that to process a context of just 1.4 million tokens, you need 8 of those high-end NVIDIA H100 GPUs. So it seems like that full 10 million token capability might be beyond the reach of most developers and definitely most users in any practical sense.
And it's not just a matter of having the hardware. There have also been reports that the model's performance can really take a hit when it's dealing with these extremely long inputs.
Right. Simon Willison shared his experience with Scout, where he tried using it to summarize a 20,000 token discussion through the Open Router service. And what he got back was, to use his words, complete junk output that quickly devolved into repetitive loops. So it really highlights that just having a large context window doesn't automatically mean the model can actually understand and process all that information effectively.
It's about quality, not just quantity, right? So, what about Maverick's benchmark performance? Has there been much independent verification of the version that's actually been released to the public?
Honestly, not really. We've seen very little in the way of independent verification for the publicly available version of Maverick, especially when it comes to those benchmarks. And as we discussed earlier, that really impressive ranking on El Marina came from a specific experimental version. So it's hard to say with any certainty how the model that developers and the public can actually use stacks up against the competition.
So, there are still a lot of unknowns when it comes to real world performance. Were there any other concerns that the AI community raised about the Llama 4 architecture itself?
There were. One of the main concerns that some AI researchers have brought up has to do with that mixture of experts approach that Meta is using. The argument is that Llama 4 might be using too few active parameters in its MoE implementation. I mean, we're talking about just 17 billion active parameters in both Scout and Maverick, even though they have these massive total parameter counts.
So, could that limited number of active experts actually be holding the models back?
Potentially. The thinking is that even with all those parameters, if you've only got a small number of experts actively engaged in any given task, the model might not be able to really leverage the full potential of its size. It could create a bottleneck, so to speak.
It sounds like the general feeling is that Meta might have rushed this release a bit or that it didn't quite live up to the hype that they built around it. Would you say that's accurate?
There's definitely a sense of that in the reactions we've seen so far. There's been quite a bit of criticism suggesting that the release felt a little hurried, or at least not as thoroughly vetted as people might have expected. And people have already started comparing Llama 4 to other recent models like DeepSeek and Quen, with some early testers saying that it's not as impressive, especially when it comes to tasks like coding.
Right, so maybe not the groundbreaking leap forward that some were hoping for. It's also interesting to think about the bigger picture of AI development, and researcher Andrei Burkhoff made a really interesting point about the limits of just scaling up model size without also focusing on improving reasoning training.
That's a really thought-provoking idea. Burkhoff pointed out that these somewhat underwhelming releases of both GPT 4.5 and now Llama 4 might be a sign that simply making these base models bigger, without also figuring out better ways to train them to reason effectively, might be hitting a wall in terms of performance gains. He's essentially saying that size isn't everything, and we need to focus on making these models smarter, not just bigger.
Quality over quantity. And it seems like Meta might have had some doubts of their own in the lead up to the Llama 4 launch. There was that report in the information suggesting that things might not have gone as smoothly as they presented it.
That's right. The report suggested that Meta actually delayed the launch several times because the model wasn't meeting their internal performance targets consistently. And it seems like the really positive buzz that DeepSeek's open weight model received might have put some additional pressure on Meta to get Llama 4 out the door, even if it wasn't quite ready.
A lot of pressure to compete in this rapidly evolving field. Bringing it back to Simon Willison, he was pretty outspoken about his experience with this whole release. Did he have any final thoughts that he shared?
Oh, he did. And he didn't mince words. He reiterated how frustrated he was, saying, the model score that we got there is completely worthless to me. I can't even use the model that they got a high score on. And to sum up his overall impression of the release, he said, it's a very confusing release generally.
So, not exactly a glowing endorsement. Even the timing of the release was a little odd, wasn't it? They chose to do it on a Saturday, which is pretty unusual for a major AI model launch.
It was definitely out of the ordinary. And when someone asked Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg about that weekend timing, his response was simply, that's when it was ready. It's a straightforward answer, but it doesn't really give much insight into the decision-making process.
Taking all of this into account, what does this all mean for developers and businesses who are trying to figure out which AI models are the right fit for their needs? It seems like this whole situation throws a wrench into the decision-making process.
It definitely makes things more complicated. Developers often rely on benchmarks as a key tool for evaluating and comparing AI models. But as we've seen, if those benchmarks are based on specialized non-public versions, or if they don't accurately reflect how the model will actually perform in real-world scenarios, they can be incredibly misleading. And that can lead to developers wasting a lot of time and resources pursuing something that might not actually deliver on its promises.
So it's becoming more and more challenging to navigate the world of AI models and make informed choices. It seems like the pressure to be at the forefront of AI development is leading to some, let's say, creative interpretations of what constitutes a win.
I think that's a fair assessment. As this field continues to evolve at such a rapid pace, we're seeing major players like Meta really pushing to establish themselves as leaders in the AI space. And this intense competition could be driving some of the behaviors we've been discussing, where achieving those top benchmark scores, even if they're achieved through unconventional means, becomes the primary focus, potentially at the expense of transparency and real-world applicability.
Despite all the initial hurdles and the somewhat critical reception, is there still reason to be optimistic about the future of the Llama 4 family? Could they still course correct and deliver something truly groundbreaking?
Well, despite all the criticism, there are still some promising avenues for improvement and future development. For example, Simon Willison expressed his hope that Meta might take a similar approach to what they did with Llama 3 and release a range of Llama 4 models at different sizes and with different capabilities, catering to a wider range of needs and use cases. He specifically mentioned being excited about the possibility of a more refined and efficient smaller model down the line.
So there's still potential for Meta to turn things around. As we wrap up our deep dive, what's the most important takeaway you think our listeners should walk away with from all of this?
The biggest takeaway here is that while Meta's Llama 4 generated a lot of initial excitement with those impressive benchmark claims and those ambitious features, the reality is a lot more nuanced. The controversy over the experimental model that was used for those benchmarks, along with the practical limitations that people are reporting with the publicly available versions, especially when it comes to that context window, really highlights the ongoing challenge of bridging the gap between the theoretical capabilities of AI and how those capabilities actually translate into real-world performance.
Right. It's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, to look beyond the hype, and really scrutinize the methodologies and the real-world usability of any new technology, especially in a field as rapidly evolving as AI.
I couldn't agree more. And as this field continues to advance at such an incredible pace, this situation really raises an important question for all of us. How do we as individuals assess the true potential and the limitations of these new AI models? How do we move beyond those potentially misleading benchmarks and develop a more critical and informed understanding of what these technologies can and cannot do? That's something for all of us to think about as we continue to navigate this brave new world of AI.
Excellent points. Thanks for joining us today, everyone, and until next time, stay curious.